So welcome. My name is Pat Brereton. I'm from the School of Communications in DCU, where I chair a Master's in Climate Change. And I'm particularly interested in this topic of discussion today as I come from the Midlands. I'm a Biffo, by the way, and I spend many summers footing turf. So I have some knowledge of this topic, and I'm interested in it for many reasons. On behalf of the Royal Irish Academy, Climate Change and Environmental Science Committee, I'm delighted to welcome you to this 5th webinar and a conversation in partnership with the EPA. The last webinar was with Eamon Haughey on land use, so it's fitting today to be discussing bogland. Our speaker today is Dr. Florence Renou-Wilson, who is the principal investigator and lecturer and director of the MSc program in Global Change, Ecosystem Science and Policy at the School of Biology and Environmental Science at UCD, and the partners of Earthly Matters Environmental Consultants, County Donegal. She has been appointed scientific advisor to the Irish Government Multi-Stakeholder Peatlands Council and has contributed as a lead author to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Wetlands Supplement, Chapter 3, Rewetting Organic Soils, and to the IPCC Special Report on Climate Change and Land, 2019, Special Report on Climate Change and Land. So we have a real expert here. So over to you, Flo, for the short presentation.
Thank you, Pat. I've got a, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Pat, and thank you for the invitation. I think you can see my slide. So it's always a pleasure to talk about peatlands, and it's a real honor to have this conversation with you all. I hope I can help to shed some light in our peatlands, which not only in Ireland but globally have been suffering from what we call the Cinderella syndrome, and often seen as a wasteland, only good to put next to the hearth for burning. But we have now recognized that peatlands are quite extraordinary ecosystems, and not least because of their role in regulating the climate. Okay, but first allow me to introduce the Irish peatlands themselves. An ecosystem of wealth and taste, indeed, and it's been around for a very long time. Because natural peatlands are wet, dead material doesn't decompose, of course. I was saying peatlands must be wet, and they are wet, and the dead material doesn't decompose, and this is why peat accumulates at a very slow rate, 1 millimeter per year. So if you look down the peat profile, I was just about to tell you that only 20 centimeter deep, the peat you see is made of dead plants and animals that lived during the Great Irish Famine. Another 50 centimeters down, that's when Columbus crossed the Atlantic, and down 1.2 meters, you see the plants that grew when the Vikings raided Ireland. And if you go all the way down to the bottom, underneath the peat, you'll find blue clay or marl, the remnants of snails and stoneworts algae, which lived in the lakes that formed after the ice retreated 10,000 years ago. So peat had begun accumulated around that time everywhere in Ireland, even in the west of Ireland. But it's really around 5,000 years BCE that the change to a wetter climate and together with unfavorable geology, and in fact, also Bronze Age tools that were used to clear trees allowed peat to accumulate like a blanket over huge areas. So in the west of Ireland, it took only 1,000 years to transform that whole area into our iconic treeless blanket bogs. And in fact, I wanted to point today, I know it's all about climate, but really the whole of Irish history is buried in our bogs, and each layer of peat is telling us what the climate was in the past, as well as what hairstyle people had and the butter they ate or didn't, for that matter. So peatlands have lived through past environmental and cultural changes, and they may also well hold answers then to address future changes as well. So it's hard to fathom how such a small area of peatlands, in fact, there's less than 3% of the Earth's surface, could have an impact on the global climate. And this is, I suppose, a problem society has of short-termisms. We rarely think of slow, long-term phenomena such as the power of peatlands to slowly but relentlessly sequester atmospheric carbon via the peatland vegetation, which upon dying and failing to decompose have accumulated as peat. So over 10,000 years, and by the way, that's more than that for the tropical peatlands, but in Ireland, 10,000 years has seen a lot of peat and therefore a lot of carbon removed from the atmospheric pool. And in fact, all over the world now, we know they have accumulated over 600 billion tons of carbon, which equates to the, in fact, it's more than the vegetation altogether, the terrestrial vegetation, including forest. So, we have quite a big pool here, which should be kept there and not released further. But let's concentrate on Irish peatland today, shall we? Peatlands cover 20% of the land surface, and just so you know, we have twice as much blanket bogs located mostly west of the Shannon than we have raised bogs, or what's left of them, in the Midlands, and a tiny amount of fens. So really, when we talk about Irish peatlands, we talk about bogs. Recent estimates from an EPA-funded Auger project indicated that our peat soils store just around 2.2 billion tons of carbon. Okay, that's a bigger estimate than what we had so far. And just so you know, our small area of natural, relatively intact bogs, which have been around for the last 10,000 years, are sequestering carbon slowly at a rate of 0.38 ton per hectare per year. But the key to the ability of sequestering carbon is water, and the water is also the key to keep that carbon locked. So intact peatlands not only hold a lot of water, it filters that water, it regulates its flow, and this is not a talk about water, but water is the very life of the bog. And understanding this is perhaps the most critical point of their management and for our climate problem. Why? Because water is very susceptible to land use changes, which all of them have attempted to remove the water. So I use this picture of a typical peatland landscape in County Mayo as a schematic to map out Irish peatland main land use over the whole country. So for example, we have 18% of our bogs in a healthy condition. Okay, that's our latest estimate, but not all of that is sequestering carbon. Okay, in fact, we know that only 1% of our raised bogs is probably sequestering carbon. There's more green parks in Dublin city centre than peat-forming raised bogs left in this entire country. So the flip side of that statistic is that 80% of our bogs are drained, and they have no more water to keep the carbon in, and they are re-emitting that carbon, because regardless of what's on top of it, be it grassland or forestry, or worse if it's cut, that carbon is being released, decomposed as soon as the bog is dry. So viewed differently, this pie chart shows the real face of our peatlands in the 21st century now. Why is this face a problem? The face of our peatlands is a problem because land use change has impacted on the water that kept the carbon stored there and on the vegetation that allowed the bog to sequester carbon once upon a time. So our drained bogs are now hotspots of CO2 emissions, and Ireland is currently reporting significant emissions from LULUCF, largely due to our ill management of our peat soils. Grasslands in particular on peat soils are our largest emitters, and we may have time to discuss more of that later compared to our mineral soils. But as if it weren't bad enough, the total emissions under peat extraction and forestry are likely to be also underestimated, due first to a lack of data on the real extent of our cutover bogs and the use of conservative emission factors for peat soils under forestry. So these hotspots need to be addressed in order to achieve our 2050 objectives. And by the way, drained peatlands have led to a suite of environmental and social problems, which I don't have time to address here. But the risk of fire and more carbon again being emitted is really an important one, as well as DOC in the water. But for the moment, let's talk about the solution then. Water is the key to our peatlands problem. The bogs need to be wet, need to be rewetted in order to reverse these negative impacts. And rewetting is clearly defined by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as the deliberate action of raising the water table on drained soils to re-establish water-saturated conditions. You do that by blocking drainage ditches or disabling pumping facilities, reprofiling surface water slope. In short, you need to manage the water table so that it remains close to the surface, not above and not fluctuating too deep either. So it's not the same as rehabilitation as we've known it so far that Bornemona has carried out until now. It's not lake creation, it's basic house plumbing. You fill the bath, you don't let it flood the bathroom. Okay, so rewetting requires serious monitoring and management of the water table so that it's close to the surface, not above. So over the last few decades, the rewetting of formerly drained peatlands has been shown to be a viable option to shut down CO2 emissions. We've measured that. And in some cases, it placed the peatland on a restoration trajectory. That is to help even bring back the sequestration potential. But rewetting of peat soils can happen under existing land use categories, be it grassland, forestry, and they can be managed this way to keep the carbon locked into the soil. Cutaways can even be rewetted and combined with wet cultivation, whereby water-loving plants are grown and harvested on wet peat soils, and this is known as paludiculture or wet farming. So today, the majority of our peatland rewetting projects have occurred on former peat extraction sites, and studies both here and abroad have shown that when rewetting is successful, so this is when the water table is brought close to the surface of the soil and is maintained at that level throughout the year, the CO2 emissions can decrease substantially and very quickly. Now, you may ask about the whole balance between CO2 and methane, and we can discuss that later. But this works as a positive overall decrease of all carbon. So current land use pressures have led to a situation whereby our peatlands are releasing substantial amount of CO2 to the atmosphere, and not only that, they have increased the loading of dissolved carbon to our rivers. So if we are serious about tackling climate change in this country, we must stop this hemorrhaging of carbon to the atmosphere and our water courses. And rewetting offers a proven option to reduce emissions and can not only that, but it can recreate conditions for the resumption of the carbon sequestration on these sites again. So together we have rewetting and restoration, which can synergistically combat not only climate change, but biodiversity and water pollution. So continuing business as usual is at odds with all others, I'd say, environmental legislation that Ireland is allegedly trying to achieve. Now it's time to really commit to a long-term sustainable management of our peatlands. And of course, as priority, we must rewet and restore our network of designated bogs. Okay, and that's critical in the equation, being the most likely to return their carbon sequestration capacity. And that's fine, but remember the original figures, that's barely 20% of our bogs. So of course we have to attack our most degraded bogs, and Bornemona Peatlands Climate Action Scheme is a very welcome step forwards to this goal. And it is critical that we get this done right with transparent monitoring and communication so we can learn and quickly adapt the techniques. And the same applies to culture, for example, the biggest peatland landowners in this country, and who has a role to play in this. But this won't suffice without the involvement of the private landowners. Farming our nutrient-rich peat soils must be addressed as a real concern here. And we know that farmers who are already farming on shallow drain, nutrient-poor peat soils that should be supported instead of asking them to drain and fertilize them further. And last December, the DAFM announced at least 40,000 hectares of drained grassland on peat soils to be targeted for rewetting. And with joggers, we will monitor the reductions achieved with careful management of the water table. But this is the right time now to go further. We must propose innovative cap support instruments to help farmers in this regards, to diversify while looking after the environment. You see, this is not just a climate solution. There are so many benefits that many people have already realized, as evidenced by the increasing membership of the Community Wetlands Forum. Many communities around the country now have projects to restore their local bogs. And the farming communities themselves have responded to this call as well to manage our peatlands. We have successful locally led EIP projects. 2 new ones have just started to find better ways to manage on-farm peat soils in the Midlands. But recall that we have twice as much blanket bogs west of the Shannon. So these bogs may need to be carefully managed now. And in fact, they may not need as much work as the ones in the Midlands because they might not be as degraded. They also hold most of the carbon store there, and they can deliver clean water, biodiversity, economic opportunities, for example, tourism and many sociocultural benefits. And I know, like, there is a project in the West, the New Life Wild Atlantic Nature Project is working on results-based payment schemes. And that's great, but we can't wait another decade before we take more action. This is actually the decade of the UN Decade of Restoration. And there is currently in Ireland and indeed elsewhere a shift in social values towards peatlands, from unsustainable use of peat to managing them for their environmental, social, cultural services for the greater good. So together we have to reimagine peatland management in order to optimize these benefits for people and nature. So we need to develop a robust long-term financial support to manage them, but also to monitor our greenhouse emissions from those bogs. To make our peatlands alive again is not only a solution in our effort to fight climate change, it's all about being really a good ancestor. So I only had a very short time to say what I want to say, but I'm sure there's loads of questions. I would like to thank David Wilson, actually, and all peatland scientists who have been working in harsh conditions over the last couple of decades in Ireland to bring the peatlands to attention. And I would like to dedicate this talk to my mentor, Professor John Feehan, who was a true bog beacon and opened the eyes of many to the wonderful secrets of our bogs, and who was just last week rightfully nominated as a member of the Royal Irish Academy. So thank you, and thank you all for joining me this afternoon.